and good morning. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. David Reznick. Dr. Lane said a lot of the things I was planning on saying, so try not to repeat things. But I want to let you know that Dr. Reznick is a preeminent evolutionary biologist who is a world leader in the empirical study of adaptation. His list of achievements and accolades are prohibitively lengthy. So please forgive me if I only highlight a few of them. He's the recipient of the E.O. Wilson Naturalist Prize. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He served as the vice president of the American Society of Naturalists and has recently been recognized as a distinguished professor in biology at UC Riverside, where his lab is based. He has published prolifically in top-tier journals with over 125 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, as well as an important and influential book on Darwin's Origin of Species. His research, well, Dr. Lane told you about his research, but let me just say, in pursuit of his research, he spent over 30 years developing a very powerful study system centered on the Trinidadian guppies, much of which you can see in his series of YouTube videos. If you haven't checked them out, I highly encourage you to do so. Today, he will be talking about his empirical studies or experimental studies on the interaction between ecology and evolution in natural populations. So with that, please welcome Dr. David Reznick.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a particular pleasure to be invited by graduate students because it implies that somebody still reads my papers, and that's always good news. And I'm hoping for a slide to come on. Do we have a presentation? Okay, when my slide does come on, right here will be a reference to a website that describes the research program that I'll be talking about today. And one of the features of the website is a video menu which was designed to make science accessible to a general audience and to explain how our integrated research program works. And the program is an integration of ecosystems ecology with population and evolutionary biology. And please tell me I'm going to have a slide up here. Okay. I'll begin by talking a little bit about the history of evolutionary ecology. The dominant question in the field of ecology in the 1950s was what determines the abundance and distribution of organisms. And in the 1950s, that had resolved into two competing ideas. One of those ideas was that populations are regulated by density-independent processes, and the alternative was that populations are regulated by density-dependent processes. That had become an unproductive conflict, and in 1962, Gordon Oriens tried to redirect that conflict by taking ecology and subdividing it into two different subdisciplines. One of those was functional ecology, which corresponds roughly to what we would think of as density-independent population regulation. And the focus of functional ecology was to study the proximate factors that contribute to abundance and distribution. And you can do that, he argued, by looking at the physiology of the organism in question and the physical environment in which it's found, and to look at a mapping of physiology on physical environment. And that was a way of understanding distributions, at least as they currently exist. He then named a second subdiscipline, which he called evolutionary ecology. And evolutionary ecology corresponded roughly to what we thought of as density-dependent population regulation. And the goal of evolutionary ecology was to look at the ultimate causes of abundance and distribution. And he thought that the ultimate causes were best characterized by looking at biotic interactions among different species and interpreting the factors that you saw as being a product of adaptation and adaptation to those interactions. Evolutionary ecology split early along into two different versions. One version is well represented in this essay by G.E. Hutchinson called The Ecological Theater and the Evolutionary Play. And in this essay, what he argued is that ecology presents a template that shapes how organisms evolve. And the idea is that ecology governs evolution. The alternative was proposed actually before the Orion's essay by David Pimentel, and that's what he referred to here as the animal population regulation by genetic feedback mechanism, which is a mouthful. What he really was talking about was what we currently refer to as eco-evo interactions. But at this point, he couched his argument in terms of density dependence. Density dependence and density independence is what people were thinking about then. But what he said here is that density influences selection, meaning that as an organism becomes more abundant in its environment, it's going to have some influence on the structure of the environment and change the kind of selection that it experiences. So selection influences genetic makeup, and then the genetic makeup influences density. The idea is that increasing density changes the environment, which changes selection, which causes the organism to evolve further. And what he was saying is that ecology and evolution are like two actors on a stage in a constant state of interacting with one another, which is fundamentally different from what Hutchinson was saying. Historically, what happened is that Hutchinson prevailed. The Hutchinsonian view of evolutionary ecology is pretty much what we would call evolutionary ecology today. Pimentel languished in the sense that he didn't disappear. His ideas were in the background of our thinking about ecology and evolution, because theorists, for example, would talk about the role of density and how introducing density regulation could modify how life histories would evolve, for example. And so there always was at least a concept of ecology playing an important role, but it was not well formed, and as I said, it was in the background. It didn't play a primary role in the discipline that we refer to as evolutionary ecology. Now, I had begun to think about the possibility of interactions between ecology and evolution in my own research because of some of the results that I had gotten. But then this result came along. It was a study program that was iconic for me in saying that, yes, this really is important and it's something that I should take more seriously. This is actually one of a series of papers that represent an integration of theory with empirical studies, experimental studies done on a model ecosystem in the laboratory. And what you're looking at here is a key result from that research program that shows the importance of ecology and evolution being two actors on the same stage and in a state of interaction with one another. What you're looking at here is a predator-prey oscillation, and the prey is an algae and the predator is a rotifer. And this upper panel represents an experiment in which there is no evolution. And the reason there's no evolution is that you have one clone of rotifer and one clone of prey. But what you're seeing is the classic predator-prey oscillation. So at the beginning, the prey are abundant, the predators are not. The predators increase in abundance as the prey decline. And then after the prey population declines to a certain degree, after some lag, the predator population will decline. And then as the predator declines, the prey will recover. This oscillation can be described in precise mathematical detail. And the models will tell you what the periods of the cycle are, what the amplitude of the cycle is, and what the lag is between the decline in the prey and the decline in the predator. This is the exact same experiment done in the exact same conditions, save one modification, which is that instead of one clone of prey, they have multiple clones of prey. And what they learned is that there are some clones that are competitively superior, but are more susceptible to predation, and other clones that are competitively inferior, but are resistant to predation. And so what happens here is that as the predator population increases and the prey population declines, the composition of the prey population is changing. Having multiple clones creates the minimalist conditions for evolution, which is a change in the relative abundance of clones. And so as the predators are causing the prey population to decline, they're also changing the genetic composition. They're selectively removing the competitively superior clones, and they're enriching the population for the predator-resistant clones. Then after a period of time, there isn't much in the way of food left, the predators will decline, and the prey population will recover. but as it recovers, the genetic composition changes again because there's a selective recovery of the competitively superior clone. So, and they know that this kind of variation exists and that the change in the genetic composition happens during the course of the interaction. But the point is that when you add this contemporary component of evolution, everything changes. The period changes, the amplitude changes, and the degree to which the peaks and troughs of the predator and prey oscillations are aligned also changes. And so this is a very dramatic way of saying that if evolution is happening in the time course of an ecological interaction, then the nature of that interaction could be fundamentally different. So this brings me to my definition for an eco-evo interaction, which is that such interactions occur when the evolution of a participant in an ecological interaction causes a change in the nature of the outcome. Or a different way of saying it would be that if an organism modifies its environment and hence the selection it experiences, causing it to evolve to a different endpoint from what you would predict if the interaction were not there. So the interactions between ecology and evolution are of interest because if you look in detail at the Hutchinsonian version of evolutionary ecology and the models that underlie them, they implicitly assume that there is no evolution. And the reason is because they treat organisms as constants. Now the idea is not that there isn't evolution, it's evolutionary ecology, but rather the idea is that the rate at which ecological interactions happen is thought to be so much faster than the rate at which organisms evolve that we can safely ignore evolution when studying ecology. And the idea of evolution is invoked after the fact and interpreting the results as being a consequence of adaptation. It's similar to the way physicists can do Newtonian mechanics and ignore relativity. We know relativity is out there and it's important, but in some frames of reference it's safe to pretend that it isn't there because its influence is so small. One of the things that we've discovered lately is that evolution can be very rapid, and the rapidity of evolution is such that it happens on a time frame that's very similar to ecological interactions, and it makes the idea of studying ecology and evolution as being actors on the same stage in a constant state of interaction much more feasible and much more accessible to empirical endeavor. So it begs the question whether or not ecology and evolution really do interact in natural ecosystems and how important are those interactions. And that was where I tried to come into the picture because these interactions were very well characterized in theory and they're well characterized in empirical models, but we know much less about what their role might be in natural ecosystems. The next question is, why should we care? Why is this an important thing to pursue? And the reason it's worth pursuing is that these interactions change the outcome of both ecology and evolution. We know from the models and from these model ecosystems that if evolution is happening and if it's interacting with the ecology, that the results are fundamentally different. So if we can learn how to measure them in nature and how to master what the interactions are and what their influences are, there's the potential that ecology and evolution can both be improved as predictive sciences. I work on guppies. This is a male guppy and this is a female guppy. And one of the attributes of male guppies is that they're very brightly colored and they're highly variable in their color patterns. And it's a lure, a sexual lure that attracts the attention of females. The virtues of guppies are such that they're an ideal animal for doing empirical work on in the field, but they're also a great laboratory animal. In the laboratory, their virtues are that they're small, so you can put a lot of them in a small laboratory, and they're relatively cheap to keep. A male is about 15 millimeters long, a female is about 20 millimeters long. They're live bearers, which means that the young are like miniature adults, and you can care for them in the same way as you would adults. And the probability of survival from birth to adulthood in the laboratory is very close to 100%. And so what that means is that you can take a representative sample of a population in nature and you can duplicate that genetic variation in a laboratory environment. A female guppy will give birth to a litter of young when she's about 10 weeks old and will give birth to litters of young about every 3 to 4 weeks thereafter. And they reproduce continuously. You don't need any special environmental cues, for example, to get them to reproduce. Another virtue of guppies is where they live. I want to acknowledge Andrew Hendry as the source of some of the best photographs that I'll show you today. This is a Hendry original. But what you're looking at is one of my study sites. All these sites are in the Northern Range Mountains of Trinidad, which are a seasonal tropical rainforest environment. They get on the order of 3 to 4 meters of rain per year. And for me, coming from California, what that means is that in a long weekend, I can see as much rain as I would see in an entire year. And for me, it feels almost like being transferred to a new planet, a rain planet, when I go there from the desert. But the important thing is that the Northern Range Mountains are well supplied with streams that run throughout the year. Another thing to remember is that this is what I refer to as a toy wilderness. Everything there is on a miniature scale in comparison to what you would see in North America. So this is a relatively large river by Trinidadian standards, and many of the rivers that I study or streams that I study are considerably smaller than this. You can step over them. And the habitats that I'm comparing are found in very close proximity to one another. And so when I talk about upstream and downstream, these are regions that may only be 100 meters or 200 meters apart. What I'm interested in Trinidad is guppies that live in two different types of communities, what I refer to as high predation and low predation communities. In high predation communities, guppies live with the sort of fish that you see right here. This one turns out to be a very important predator on guppies. In a 10-gallon tank, a guppy has a half-life of less than a second with one of these fish. In nature, it turns out that they're very good at evading these predators. And so a large adult like this will eat on the order of a half a guppy to a guppy per day. But that's enough for them to have a profound influence on the biology of guppies. These fish can really hurt you. They're the largest predator in the ecosystem. These fish are like miniature piranhas. They're relative piranhas, and they have the same sort of triangular sharp teeth, and also can be a serious predator on guppies. In low predation environments, this is the only fish that guppies co-occur with. It's the killifish Gribulus hardi, and it will occasionally eat guppies as well, but it mostly eats terrestrial invertebrates. This is a summary of the first 15 years of my career. What I was interested in is how this contrast between high and low predation would influence the evolution of guppy life histories. And in particular, what I had found was that when guppies live with predators, they have higher mortality rates, which makes sense. And there was a body of theory that predicted how life history should evolve in response to reduced life expectancy. And so originally I evaluated that theory by doing comparative studies. And I found that guppies from the high predation environments do in fact mature at an earlier age. They reproduce more often. They devote more resources to each litter of young. And all these differences were as predicted by life history theory. But then it also is possible to do experimental evolution, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But the point of experimental evolution is that it was possible to manipulate the distribution of guppies and predators and predict how they would evolve, and then test that prediction. Okay, this is a cartoon to help you remember the differences between guppies from these different types of environments. So I want you to burn this image into your brain. This is a high predation guppy where the mothers are small at maturity and they give birth to many small babies. This is a low predation guppy where the mothers are larger at maturity and give birth to a few large babies. These differences that you see right here are parameterized on real average values that I see in natural populations. And the point is that the differences aren't subtle. There aren't small statistical issues. They're large and prominent differences between guppies from these different types of environments. This is another slide to make the point that these are not subtle differences. This is a collection of males from a low predation locality on the Aripo River and a high predation locality on the Aripo River. And you can see that the high predation males, which are younger at maturity, are also considerably smaller at maturity. So one of the attributes that's evolving in this system is body size. An important feature of studying these kinds of adaptations in Trinidad is that the natural environment which they're found are these streams that are draining the Northern Range Mountains. The ridgeline of the Northern Range Mountains runs east-west. Then you have a series of streams that drain either the south slope or the north slope. And repeated in each of them is this contrast between high and low predation. So coded in red is a high predation locality, coded in blue is a low predation locality. And we know from genetics that many of these rivers, the adaptation of guppies to these alternative environments is an independent event. It represents convergent evolution. So Trinidad presents us with what you can think of as being a naturally replicated experiment. Whenever I talk about guppies having genetic differences in their life histories, that's based not on fish that I catch and evaluate in nature, but rather on experiments that I do in the laboratory. So what I'll do is to collect a series of adult females, bring them back to my laboratory, put one in each of these aquaria, and then take advantage of a handy feature of guppy reproductive biology, which is that females store sperm and they reproduce continuously. So every one of those isolated females will give birth to a series of litters, which then will become a numbered pedigree and a laboratory study. And I'll carry the animals through 2 generations in a common environment using a breeding design that retains all of the initial genetic variation, or as much as possible, and avoids any kind of inbreeding. And it's my evaluation of the grandchildren reared in a common environment that's the basis of saying that there are genetic differences. If there are persistent differences between populations in that context, it's very likely that those are genetic differences. I also, at times, do hybridization and other studies to do more to characterize what those genetic differences are. When I rear the young, I rear them 1 per aquarium and give them quantified amounts of food, which means I know everything that goes into them, and in that context I measure when they mature, how many babies they produce, and how often they reproduce. So I look at everything that comes out. I can reconstruct what I refer to as the pie of life, the total pie of resources, and how they divide those resources up among different types of functions. Another important feature of Trinidad is that very often there are barrier waterfalls. It's a very steeply eroded topography, so you very often find waterfalls, and those waterfalls punctuate the fish community. So you might, for example, be able to find guppies in a high predation environment below the waterfall and guppies without predators above the waterfall. And what that means is that you can contrast these 2 different types of communities in populations that are found only tens of meters apart in physical environments that are virtually identical to one another. And even when they're that close, they still are as different as you would see if you were comparing a headwater stream with downstream areas. And that makes it very likely that the cause of those differences is something different, something, for example, that's down here but isn't up here. It makes a stronger argument for predators as being the cause of the life history patterns that we see. But then what I also did was experimental evolution. I treated streams as if they were giant test tubes. So, for example, in a setting like this, we often find waterfalls that block guppies and predators, and above the waterfall, coated in blue, is a stretch of stream that only has the killifish, and it's guppy-free. And so, before I did this, John Edler did it, and I've done it again. What we did was to take guppies from this high predation site below the barrier waterfall and introduce them into the previously guppy-free, but now low predation site above the barrier waterfall. And that becomes the experimental population, and the population down here is a control. And evolution is inferred by the magnifying differences between them in their life histories and other attributes. It also, sometimes we find waterfalls that stop predators but not guppies. And so here's a stretch of stream with guppies but not predators, and you can take a predator from here and put it here, and it will extend its range to the next waterfall in line. And in that way you can increase the guppy's risk of mortality. In both of these contexts, we saw guppy life histories evolve. But the interesting thing was how quickly they evolved. When I told people I wanted to do this kind of experiment in the 1980s, they would often smile and say, "It's a great idea. We hope you live long enough to see something happen." By 1985, I saw something happen, and in fact, so much had happened that I realized that by waiting 4 years, I probably had missed something, that things had happened more rapidly than that. That's where the inference of rapid evolution came from. Life was good in the sense that for the first 15 years of my career, everything added up. Everything did exactly as what was predicted to happen using the first generation of simple life history theory. And then I made a series of observations that suggested that perhaps life was more complex than I had expected. And I'm going to be talking about a couple of those observations right now. One of the things I was interested in was the evolution of senescence. It's a corollary of life history theory that differences among populations in risk of mortality and in life expectancy should select for differences in the aging process. And in particular, the guppies from high predation environments invest more in reproduction, and they begin to reproduce at an earlier age. And theory assumes that you pay a price for that. And the price is that you're taking resources away from maintenance or away from growth, or in some way eating into your future potential. And so the prediction is that these animals should have intrinsically higher mortality rates and shorter lifespans. But the reality was that they in fact had much longer lifespans and lower intrinsic mortality rates throughout their lives. Furthermore, what we found is that they had more offspring earlier in their lives, they continued to have more offspring per unit time for the entirety of their lives, and they continued to reproduce to a more advanced age than did guppies from low predation environments. It was sort of like a living nightmare in the sense of results not turning out the way you would expect them to. And it also begged an important question. What it was telling us is that, at least in this context, guppies from high predation environments are super guppies. They're flat out superior to low predation guppies, and the low predation life history should never evolve. And yet the low predation life history had evolved. I had seen it evolve in the context of my own experiments. And so the question was, why did this happen? Now, one of the consequences of these kinds of results is that they caused me to think about the models that I was using as a source of my prediction. And the first early generation models that I used were as illustrated here. Those are models without any element of ecology at all. They're models that allow your organism to increase in population size exponentially, which carries the implicit assumption that resources are unlimited forever and ever. And the only thing that you're really looking at is how predators are affecting the risk of mortality, the life expectancy of the fish. There are now later generation models that incorporated elements of ecology, and what I'm calling Model 2 here is really just an example of a family of models. But what I include in Model 2 is the idea that the predator can feed back on itself, that the predator population growth, if the prey population growth, if the predator isn't there, will be logistic, meaning that resources are limited and they'll reach some kind of carrying capacity. And just adding that small element of ecological reality or realism to the model can change the nature of the prediction on how animals will evolve in response to certain types of selection. And some of those models could resolve the dilemma of what I'd seen in the high predation guppies, but also the dilemmas that were associated with some of my other research. Now, this is meant to give you a more realistic image of what we mean by logistic population growth and what happens to prey populations when you take the predators out. This is from an article by Estes et al. In Science. But these are 3 photographs taken of ecosystems when predators were still there, and this is what they looked like decades later when the predators were gone. Here, what happens here is that without the predator, the prey proliferate and they consume desirable resources and actually change the structure of their environment. So when we talk about population regulation, what happens when animals become abundant in their environment, what we're talking about is animals that are actually imposing some kind of change on their environment. And the question was whether or not there's any evidence for seeing this in guppies. I had earlier done a comparative ecology study of guppies, and in fact we see in guppies exactly the sort of thing that you saw on the previous slide. What you're looking at here is the biomass per unit area on average in guppies in a high predation environment versus a low predation environment. And the idea is that when you take predators out, guppies become much more abundant. Their biomass per unit area is about 5 times higher. Here you're looking at the size distribution of guppies. High predation populations are dominated by small guppies with fewer larger ones. The low predation environments have more even size distribution. That's because the high predation guppies mature young, have lots of babies, but have short life expectancy. The low predation guppies mature when they're old and have few babies, but they have a higher life expectancy. Here we're looking at the average growth rate of guppies from a high predation environment versus a low predation environment. And what we find is that the guppies that are living with predators have much higher growth rates, and in other regards appear to have much higher levels of resource availability than their counterparts that live without predators. So what this suggests is indirect effects of predation. Predators kill guppies, but they reduce population density, they alter age and size structure, they appear to indirectly increase resource availability. And conversely, when you take predators out of the picture, density increases and resource availability declines. Okay, this brings me to the argument for eco-evo interactions. Theorists have often invoked density regulation as an important factor in shaping how animals evolve, and we can see evidence for density regulation in natural environments. Those photographs that I showed you earlier represent what we call a trophic hierarchy, or keystone species. And we know of these things in hundreds of different ecosystems. There's a very large literature about this kind of phenomena in natural environments, but what hasn't been considered is what the evolutionary consequences of these interactions might be. And in particular, when we talk about density regulation, evolutionary biologists treat it as a black box. It just says that if there's more of your animal there, something happens, but we have no idea what would happen. And so the idea was to characterize what the inside of that box looks like. And the important thing is that theory says that when these things happen, they really do affect the way organisms adapt to their environment. So this brings me to the current research program, which is to look at this interaction, the idea that evolution can shape ecology and that ecology can shape evolution. And when we look at this in natural ecosystems, we're doing it with a consortium of different types of experiments. We don't have quite the same ability to manipulate ecology and evolution as they do in a laboratory ecosystem. So it requires an integration of different types of approaches. The first approach that I'll talk about is what I refer to as retrospective evolution. And these are experiments that were done in artificial streams in which we take guppies from different environments and then bring them together in a replicated, semi-natural environment and compare them. And the idea is that guppies from high and low predation communities represent the endpoints of an evolutionary process, and we want to see what the consequence of those differences are. In particular, in this first experiment, we'll ask how ecology shapes evolution, and we're interested initially in what can explain the evolution of the low predation phenotype. This work was led by Ron Basser, who was formerly my graduate student and is now a postdoc at Oxford University doing a continuation of this project. These are our artificial streams. Behind these artificial streams is a natural stream. And what we did was to take water from a spring that would have been up here, whose outflow normally went into the natural stream. We diverted some of it into this tank, and from the tank it's gravity fed into these pools, or into these channels. The channels are filled with natural substrate, they're colonized with invertebrates. We work with ecosystems ecologists who can evaluate the structure of the ecosystem and can confirm that they're reasonably well replicated and a good representation of what a natural stream would look like. And then we use these as a experimental replicate for doing factorial experiments. The first experiment we did was to compare guppies from a low predation environment and a high predation environment reared at either low or high population densities. And the important thing to realize is that we already had quantified what population densities are like in nature, so we were able to parameterize the way we set up these experiments to represent natural densities. But we also know how guppies normally would perform, what their growth rates would be in a natural environment, and we can quantify the growth rate of the guppies in these experiments and see whether or not our experiments really did capture what would go on in the real world. And the answer was that they generally did. They're all well parameterized, and we get performances that are similar to what you would see in a natural setting. The other point is that we replicated this experiment. We did it once with guppies from one river, high and low predation environments within this river. Then when we were done, we tore the whole thing down, set it up again, and restarted it, and redid the experiment with guppies from a different river, where they have, again, adapted to life with and without predators. And doing it twice means that we have an independent degree of freedom that's associated with predation, and it's independent of the river in which the experiment was done. Okay, here you're looking at a key result, and what you're looking at here on the y-axis is a point estimate of population growth rate, which is a point estimate of relative fitness of guppies. During the course of this experiment, we know how much each individual grew, what its probability of survival was, and what the rate of reproduction was. And you can take all of these numbers and put them together into a life table model that will project what the population growth rate would be. And at low population densities, and here are our replicates, just to show you that the results are repeatable, but at low population densities, what we find is that the low predation guppies are maintaining a stable population, they have a population growth rate of 1, but that the high predation guppies have considerably higher fitness. Their projected population growth rates are about 35 to 40% higher. At high population densities, the high predation guppy advantage disappears. They all have declining populations, but the point is that the high predation guppies are much more sensitive to population density than are the low predation guppies. And this is one way of saying that part of what's going on in these fish is that low predation guppies are adapted to high population density. It's not enough to explain the evolution of the low predation life history, because if they're going to evolve, they have to be better and they have to have a positive population growth rate, a population growth rate of greater than 1. But it at least is evidence of density having played an important role in shaping the evolution of the low predation phenotype. So the conclusion then is that high predation guppies have higher fitness at low population densities. They really are a super guppy in that context, but that the differences disappear at high population densities. One of my other PhD students, Matt Walsh, did a detailed study of the interactions between guppies and killifish, the only other fish that lives with them in these low predation environments. And I love the results of this work because up until this point in time, guppies were always the victim. They were always the animal that was being eaten by something else and evolving in a fashion that enabled them to survive. And what emerged from this study is that guppies are also the aggressor. Killifish, adult killifish may eat baby guppies, but it turns out that adult guppies also eat baby killifish. And what Matt showed is that guppies are actually shaping the evolution of rivulus life histories at the same time that rivulus are shaping guppy life histories. And he also showed the mechanism, which is that guppies are indirectly influencing rivulus evolution by changing the structure of the environment and changing resource availability. So what this suggested is that we should also look at what the interaction between guppies and rivulus might be in shaping the evolution of the low predation life history. This is just a schematic of a natural river. And what you find upstream are sites where you just have killifish. If you go down below a barrier waterfall, then you have killifish with guppies at high densities. And then if you go down below another barrier waterfall, you have predators and still killifish and guppies, but at much lower population densities. What population genetics tells us is that the guppies that you find in these low predation localities are probably guppies that invaded from downstream, from high predation localities downstream, and then established populations and adapted to life in a new environment. So what we do is to set up an experiment that imitated what we think of as the sequence of events that's associated with that colonization. One treatment just had rivulus, derived from a locality that only had rivulus. The second treatment represents the initial invasion, which is to pair high predation guppies at a high density with rivulus. The third treatment is to assume that the guppies evolve, which means pairing guppies from a low predation environment with rivulus, again collected from a site where they do not co-occur with rivulus. And then the fourth treatment was to then have the rivulus adapt to guppies. So that we're pairing guppies from a low predation environment with rivulus from an environment where they are co-adapted to life with guppies. We again replicated this experiment. We did it once with guppies and rivulus from one river system, then we tore the whole thing down and set it up again, and did it again with guppies and rivulus from a different river, and these are ones that we know are genetically quite distinct from one another and represent independent evolutionary events. Here are the results. In the first treatment, when we paired high predation guppies with rivulus, this is the early invasion, what we have is it says that the high predation guppies can persist. They have a population growth rate of 1, so it will be stable. When we compare low predation guppies with rivulus that are not co-adapted to guppies, what we find is that now, in this context, with the combination of rivulus and high population density, that the low predation guppies have a significantly higher population growth rate than the high predation guppies. And so it's this combination of characters that actually favors the low predation phenotype. But the interesting thing is that when we substitute rivulus that are co-adapted to life with guppies for rivulus that are not, then the population growth rate of the guppies is higher still, which means that what it suggests is that there's some sort of ecological displacement between the killifish and the guppy, which again further favors the evolution of the low predation phenotype. This result again was very precisely replicated when we did it with fish from 2 different river systems. So what this is saying is that ecology does shape evolution, but in particular, an aspect of ecology includes guppies and guppy population density, but it also includes the phenotypes of the other community members, and some features of those phenotypes are ones that were shaped by the presence of guppies. The next question was asking whether or not evolution shapes ecology. I mean, part of the argument here doesn't include evolution. It just says, do guppies change the structure of their ecosystem? That has to be a demonstrable feature of the guppy invasion for us to be able to argue that ecology and evolution really are 2 actors on the same stage. This again was work done by Ron, and it in fact is the same experiment, but looking at it in an expanded fashion. Because in this experiment where we looked at low and high predation guppies and low and high densities, we also had channels that had no guppies at all. And the idea was to measure the guppy effect on the ecosystem by comparing these 4 treatments with this one, but then also asking whether or not ecosystem impacts evolved by comparing these two treatments with these two. And again, I remind you this experiment was replicated. Okay, here you'll be looking at guppy impacts on the ecosystem, and this first variable is the standing crop of algae in these channels after 4 weeks. And if you compare these four, so this is algal abundance on the y-axis, and if you compare these 4 treatments with this one, what it's telling you is that guppies deplete algal resources. This also tells you that guppies from low predation environments deplete them to a greater degree than those from high predation environments. This is a log scale, and so the magnitude of this difference is actually over twofold. And then finally, you see an independent effective density. If there are more guppies there, then they deplete the resources further. This is a slide of one of the experimental treatments that was incorporated into each channel. And it lets you visualize the magnitude of the way guppies are influencing their environment. Because this is a rectangle made of copper tubing that's sitting on the bottom of the stream. This is an identical rectangle, but the difference is that this one is hooked up to a battery and a fence charger, so that every second it puts a weak electric pulse through the coil. It repels guppies, but it doesn't have any influence at all on invertebrates. And so the difference between these two channels is a measure of what guppies do to their environment in 4 weeks. Guppies are constantly grooming. They're constantly pecking the surface and picking up invertebrates and moving sediment around. And when you take guppies out, sediment accumulates, the diatoms begin to grow, and within just a few weeks you get this complete carpet of golden brown diatoms without guppies in the system. And for me, this was profound, because deep down inside, I did not think that guppies would change their ecosystem. I thought they were like an ornament on the environment that were interesting to study, and we could study their evolution. But although it was logical to do this, I didn't expect it to turn out, and certainly not to be as dramatic as it was. Here you're looking at the effects of guppies on invertebrate abundance. And again, if you average these 4 points with this one, it tells you that guppies deplete invertebrates in their natural environment. But here, you look at this line versus this one, it's telling you that guppies from high predation environments deplete invertebrates to a much greater degree than do guppies from low predation environments. Okay, at the end of the experiment, we preserved all the guppies, and that's when we dissected them and looked at their birth schedule for doing the integrated population modeling, integral population modeling. But we also looked at what they ate, and what you're looking at here is that the guppies from the high predation environment were eating much more in the way of invertebrates than the ones from the low predation environment. And the guppies from the low predation environment were eating much more in the way of diatoms and detritus than the guppies from the high predation environment. In other work, what we've shown is that high predation guppies will prey selectively on high-quality invertebrate prey, and low predation guppies are like vacuum cleaners. They basically will scoop up what's ever in their path without any regard to its abundance or its quality. They're basically just taking a random sampling of whatever is present. Okay, what these results show you is that evolution affects ecology. The first thing is just that guppies change the ecosystem. That part didn't require evolution, but it satisfies the prerequisite of saying that guppies can change their ecology, which can reshape how they evolve. But the other thing that we found is that high and low predation guppies differ in their impact on the ecosystem, and that these differences are largely a product of diet. The differences also are much broader than what I presented here. They affect the rate at which leaves decompose, which affects the rate at which nutrients are released into the environment. They also affect nutrient cycling in their environments. Okay, that represents what I called retrospective evolution. But one of the things that we can do in this system is also look at prospective evolution. We can do experiments in which we introduce guppies, and then we look at the dynamics of how guppies change their environment at the same time that we can study the evolution of the guppies. And in that context, we can look at the interaction between ecology and evolution as it happens in real time. Now, I see that I've spoken too slowly and that I'm running out of time, and so I'm going to skip a couple of slides and just show you some highlights. The main thing that we did was to find 4 streams where guppies, where all fish are excluded except killifish. We introduced guppies, and we were assessing the ecosystem for a year before the guppies were introduced, and then we continued to assess them after the guppies were introduced. These experimental reaches are about 65 to 165 meters. They're restricted in size. One of the things that we did was to have founders that were individually marked, and we plucked scales from each of them as a source of DNA, and we're using the DNA to reconstruct the pedigrees of these evolving populations. We also have collaborators who now have a complete genome sequence for the founding population. And so part of what we were trying to do as an added value was to create a system in which we can look at the genetics of adaptation. And that's one of the directions that we're taking in our research right now. Every month we do a detailed census in which we have a greater than 90% probability of seeing every fish that's alive in the system, which means that we have about a 99+% probability of seeing every fish that survives to be an adult in that system. All new recruits are individually marked, and we also take scales from them all so that we can use them for constructing the pedigree and creating a DNA archive. This just shows you that we're seeing an impact of guppies on their ecosystem in this context. We're seeing that the guppies are, in fact, depleting invertebrate abundance. We're also seeing that guppies are depleting the abundance of rivulus. What you're looking at here is the introduction site versus the control site. And there's a shift in the size distribution because guppies have cut off the recruitment of young rivulus. And we're also seeing a significant decline in the abundance of rivulus after the guppy introduction. So we're seeing the same kinds of things that parameterize the natural environment and that you would predict from the artificial stream experiments. So we have a significant impact of guppies on their ecosystem in this context. We've looked at the evolution of guppies, and they have in fact evolved in the course of this experiment. We're studying that in real time. The other thing that we've done, this is obvious I think to all of us, right? Maybe not. Okay, so this is an individual. The blue line goes to the father, the red line goes to the mother. We were able to reconstruct the pedigree for all of these populations. And what you're looking at here is individual reproductive success. We're able to assign the number of offspring to each parent, and we know who the parents are. We have photographs of them. We have their genotypes. We have archived DNA from them. And so what it means is that we can study evolution on an individual basis, as variation in individual reproductive success. And so the end product that we have from this work then is an archive of DNA from every individual, 4 replicate populations. We have a record of photographs. We can look at evolution in 2 ways. The traditional way is by the change in population mean over time. Another, less traditional way is as variation in individual reproductive success. What we know now is that guppies do indeed change their ecosystem. They do it by depleting resource availability, altering the abundance of the killifish, and causing the killifish to evolve. We know the ecosystem impacts evolve as guppies adapt to life with or without predators. We know that low predation guppies are less selective consumers. That's a result that I didn't show here, but it's a published result. We know that density-dependent selection and rivulus guppy coevolution together appear to resolve the dilemma of the super guppy and explain why the low predation life history evolves. It doesn't really tell us why. It sort of defines it in the broad sense. But why it happens is something that we're still hoping to work on. And we know that rivulus life history evolution is driven by guppy ecosystem effects. What we don't know is the full impact of guppies on the ecosystem in natural streams. And it remains to be proven that guppy adaptation to low predation streams is driven in part by their impact on the ecosystem. We have a good set of circumstantial evidence that says that it really is, and we know some of the elements of it, but that again represents areas of continued study. I want to end with a final image of something that represents an event that happened to me when I was in Trinidad, but it's also something that's kept me moving as a scientist. There was a day when I was bending down over a stream looking for the last guppy, and I stood up, and I have low blood pressure, so when I stand up, I often get dizzy and wobble a little bit. Then turned around and was confronted by this. Fortunately, I had a camera to capture the event. But what it reminded me of is what keeps me going as a scientist. I always say that fear and dismay are wonderful motivators, and the steep gradient of the National Science Foundation is something that keeps me active and interested at a level that would always be there, but certainly a higher level of motivation than I would have otherwise. Thank you very much.